So my name is Caroline Bald, and I am the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Group of BASWA with Helen Woods, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Kirsty Kitchen, who's the Head of Policy and Communications from Birth Companions. She's been somebody that I have worked with for, we believe now, 4 years, and her passion for the subject of maternal imprisonment, and particularly pregnancy, and whether somebody who's pregnant should be in prison, is something that she and I have discussed often, and it's a real bone of contention in terms of where criminal justice and social work cross over and that intersection. So she's been coming into my classes at the University of Essex regularly. We're lucky that you're just down the road, so thank you for that, and you talk for the price of a coffee. And it's been great getting to know you. So I'm really, really chuffed to bits that she's been able to come and share the work of Birth Companions here for the BASWA groups. So it will be recorded, so unfortunately if people aren't able to attend here, they can certainly look back on it in their own time. There will be time for questions, but what I'll do now is hand over to Kirsty, and I'll switch my camera off. I'd encourage you to switch yours off as well, and then Kirsty will share screen and present. Again, just a reminder for those who maybe missed the beginning, that this session is being recorded, and so please be conscious of your own confidentiality if you wish to, and that chat is the space for questions if you'd like to put it there, and we'll make sure that Kirsty get those toward the end. Also, if you'd like to connect with Kirsty herself, I'm sure she'll be more than happy to share her email address at the end if it's on your slides, I believe. But also, please just make sure that you connect if you would like to take this further. And we will, of course, be discussing this and this area of practice, and particularly around mental health, I think, as well, when we talk about it in the next meeting for those who are members of the group. So thank you for bearing with us. That's 23 in the room. And so what I'll do now is hand over to Kirsty. So thank you so much for doing this for us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Wayne as well for setting up the event today. Thank you so much, for inviting me to come and talk to the group today. I just think that the fact that BASWA has a CJS group is in itself really, really important, and something that I was delighted to hear about when Caroline first mentioned it. So, and now I'm here with you talking about issues very, very close to my heart. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Birth Companions, not too much. You can find out a lot more about us on our website if you're interested, or you can contact me at the end. I'm very happy to share the slides afterwards, or the information on the slides in an alternative format if people want it as well. And I'm hopeful that what I'm going to do is give you a kind of overview of the work that we have been doing very recently, but through our services for a very long time, on dual contact with criminal justice and children's social care systems. And then we're going to have time for questions and discussion at the end, which I expect I would learn a lot through, as always with those things. So a little bit about Birth Companions first. We are an organisation that started in 1996. We grew with a focus on the criminal justice system. So we first started working with pregnant women and mothers of infants in Holloway Prison in North London, when that was still a thing. But we very quickly expanded into an organisation that was fundamentally focusing on women who experience acute disadvantage and inequality in pregnancy and early motherhood. And we do that through a range of services in the prison system, still around the country, several women's prisons, through the probation system in London and the South East, but also through our wider community-based services that are not CJS specific, but often have a lot of very similar issues happening for women in the lives of them and their families to what we see in those criminal justice linked services as well. We are a women-centred organisation. We are, every aspect of our work is predicated on being non-judgmental, and we were talking about trauma-informed before trauma-informed was such a big thing. We do a huge amount of work to embed trauma-informed approaches in all of the systems that we work in, and I will tell you a little bit more about those systems now. Obviously, the maternity system is a kind of universal system that the vast majority of the women that we work with are in some contact with. But we also work with a particular focus on the criminal justice system, the immigration system, and social services, particularly children's social care, because they are very dominant in the lives of women in our services. They also interlink and overlap in very important ways as well. Our work is built on 3 pillars, really. So we have our frontline services, antenatally, we support women during birth and across the postnatal period, whether or not they have that child still in their care. Our services tend to work with women up to a year after their baby has been born, but overall we work with a focus on the 1001 critical days. So that's the period from the point of conception up to a child's 2nd birthday, which is recognised as crucial to long-term development and outcomes, as I'm sure you all recognise. It can be challenging sometimes to get services commissioned for that entire period, and that's part of the fight that we are continuing to have. We have a 50-strong team of women with lived experience. Most of them have come through our services, who now work with us to shape and inform policy and services, our own services, but also much more widely, and they feed into research and development of guidance and service design and service commissioning increasingly. And that's an incredible resource, and you can always contact us if you are trying to do a piece of work that would benefit from hearing from the voices of those women. We put a huge amount of work into making sure that engagement can be done safely and meaningfully, and in a trauma-informed way. And our policy and influencing work, which is what I lead with my team, is really taking everything that we learn from our frontline service delivery and through our lived experience team and the work of wider organisations to shape those systems fundamentally, to provide the best support that they can and to address gaps and shortcomings in practice. So moving on to kind of what we're here to talk about today, we've recently published a paper on what we've described as dual contact. That's particularly dual contact between the criminal justice system and the children's social care system in that 1001 days. The reason that we've done that is because while there has been some increased focus on pregnancy and early motherhood in the prison system, largely driven by us and the work of some excellent organisations that we collaborate very closely with, really the sort of understanding of the particular ways that women's fears of or experiences of children's social care involvement, it's still not taking hold in that system. It's very, very complex. Those are 2 very complex overlapping systems, and particularly it hasn't really taken hold outside of the prison context, so thinking about community criminal justice settings as well. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. We believe there's really significant work to be done to improve outcomes for those women and for their babies. It's worth just sort of reflecting on the fact that 31% of women who enter prison are themselves care experienced, and so that obviously has a huge bearing. We don't know how many women who have contact with the criminal justice system in the community have care experience, but it's going to be as high, if not higher. So that's another important part of this overlap, really. There's lots and lots of forms that this dual contact can take, and I'll touch on a few of them today, but obviously, as you will all understand, they are myriad. Before I go any further, I think I really wanted to kind of highlight the very tragic case of baby Aisha Cleary, who was born in her mother's prison cell in Bronzefield in 2019 and died, because it sort of really casts a very strong light on how complex this dual contact can be, and the severity of the impacts, really. So for those of you who don't know that case, Aisha's mother had been in and out of care herself for her entire life, moved around the country. She had actually been in receipt of some excellent care at points in her life from children's social services and others, including charities. But what was very clear in the inquest into her death, which heard from over 50 witnesses, it ran for almost 5 weeks last summer, spring, summer, was that while there were pockets of excellent care, the multi-agency working, and particularly the overlap between criminal justice and social care, was really flawed, and ultimately, played a very, very fundamental role, as the coroner himself recognised, in the unfortunate death of Aisha. Aisha died because when her mother Rhianna pressed her cell bell for help when she was in labour, no medical attention was given. No one visited her cell, and she ended up labouring and giving birth on her own. And so clearly that's a prison issue and a healthcare issue. But actually, when you look at the whole judgment, and I would encourage you all to read it, it's available online, it tells us a lot more about opportunities to prevent Rhianna from being in that space in the first place, and to address the fundamental fears about separation from her baby that had made relationships between Rhianna and the staff in prison and in healthcare incredibly fraught at times. But the coroner's evidence sessions heard from 2 of the local authorities involved in the care of Rhianna, the mother, actually, and one of those local authorities said that sort of back and forth between them and another team will have left her feeling unwanted and uncared for. And I think that was reflected in what Rhianna said herself in her evidence to the court. She said, "Why was I made to feel like I would never have a chance with my baby? Why could no one speak to me in a way that understood my past experiences? When I was pregnant, I felt like everyone in authority was putting pressure on me, like other people were making decisions for me and I was not involved. I felt like nobody in the community and in prison was trying to understand me or what was going on for me. I did not feel that anyone was on my side. I felt they were not giving me a chance before she, Aisha, was even born." So that's how dual contact with criminal justice and children's social care played out for one mother and baby. And I think there are real learnings from that case that are being applied, but that need to be more fully learnt. So dual contact in prison. Again, many of you will be aware of this, but there's been a heightened focus on the care of women who are pregnant while they are in custody. Last year, the government published the total of number of women in the preceding year who had been pregnant while in prison for the first time that data was ever shared, and it was 194. Obviously, a lot of those women leave before they give birth, but not all. 44 women gave birth while being held in custody, and 78 applied to a prison mother and baby unit, which is probably the point at which, there's the biggest level of social care involvement from the Women's Home Local Authority. But that's not the entirety of it, because a lot of women enter prison and leave an infant in the community, right? There's a lot of women that enter prison within days or weeks of giving birth, or, you know, while their child who is under the age of 2 is being cared for, either, you know, maybe in foster care or in kinship care arrangements, or being, you know, cared for by the other parent with parental responsibility. And that, you know, they have to navigate that as well. Or they might have a child that's already in care and then have to navigate maintaining that contact with that child, if that's been arranged, while they've moved sometimes 150, 200 miles away into a custodial environment. So that crossover is really key. And you need to think about women who are leaving prison and the way that that transition happens around care involvement as well. Remand is a massive issue in women's prisons at the moment. Around 50% of women that are in prison at the moment are there on remand. So they have not been sentenced, they have not been found guilty. They are awaiting sentencing, and a magistrate or a judge has decided that they need to be in prison while they wait for that sentencing to happen. That creates huge issues around care for pregnant women or mothers of infants, because you've got a situation of huge uncertainty, very difficult to make plans. And when that woman does go to sentencing, there's a very high likelihood that they will be released directly from the court on that day, because they'll either have served more time than they were going to be given in the first place, or they will be found not guilty or given a community sentence or some alternative. So remand's a massive issue. 30% of pregnant women are held in prison on remand. But a lot of the focus, as I said, has been on prison and not enough on criminal justice contact in the community. So a huge number of women affected by that. You've got women who are awaiting sentencing, got women who are serving community sentences or on treatment, fulfilling treatment requirements. And you've got women who are under probation supervision after having been released from custody. And a lot of them, but we don't know how many, are likely to be pregnant or have a child under the age of 2, especially when you think that the vast majority of female defendants dealt with in court are aged 18 to 39. We expect more women to be serving community sentences or under suspended sentences than currently, because of the government's commitment to reducing the female prison population, although they repeat that commitment very often and it doesn't really affect the numbers. What's really interesting is when you read research done with magistrates or Crown Court judges, when they give out community sentences or they set out treatment requirements for women as an alternative to custody, or because they are being charged with a very low level offence, they don't consider the impact of pregnancy or caring responsibilities for young children. 4 out of 5 magistrates in a recent piece of research said that they had no idea what the childcare arrangements would be for a woman who had a young child who they were expecting to engage with a mental health treatment programme or a drug or alcohol treatment requirement. And then what happens, unfortunately, is that we see women breaching their licence conditions or not meeting the requirements of the order that they have been given, and then they're immediately sent into prison and very often separated from that baby unless they can arrange a quick mother and baby unit application. So we looked at that in a recent report that we did for in partnership with Clinks, a criminal justice-led organisation. And it's an area that needs real work, particularly probation services needing to understand the 1001 days and the impact that period has for everyone involved. Then turning to sort of look at children's social care involvement in pregnancy and early years more widely, we all know tens of thousands of women have contact with children's social care in the 1001 critical days. There's been a huge rise in the number of newborns and infants subject to care proceedings in the last decade. Also, unfortunately, there's been a sustained rise in the number of women who die in pregnancy or the first year after giving birth who have social services involvement at the time of their death. That figure has risen from 12% in 2012 to 21% in 2019. And unfortunately, a large number of those deaths have been maternal suicide or death through substance misuse. So the need is very acute to sort of get a handle on this overlap, even when we're not factoring in the criminal justice side of things. The drivers for social care referral in pregnancy and early years are very similar to the drivers for women ending up in contact with criminal justice system. They are unmet mental health need, domestic violence and abuse, substance use, and there's a high prevalence of care experience across the board. So that's that overlap is real. That's why we published the Birth Charter for Women with Involvement from Children's Social Care from a widespread kind of community point of view. Last year, we identified 14 principles for the care of women across all systems: health, social care, the family justice and criminal justice systems. And we developed that in partnership with women with lived experience, but also professionals from all of those systems. And one of the key recommendations, I'd encourage you to read it, is a call for a national joint health and social care pathway to be embedded throughout every integrated care system, every probation area, every local authority, through social care housing, to sort of draw a common set of resources and a common commitment to providing the absolute best care for these women and their babies. We're a long way off that at the moment, unfortunately. Going a little bit more into the nature of dual contact and why it can be so problematic. Clearly, one of the factors here is the transferal of social work to probation, which means that a lot of social workers don't have a sort of high level of criminal justice knowledge and understanding. And so when they do come to work with, say, a young child whose mother is in prison, they've never been in a prison environment, they've never visited a mother and baby unit. These are the kinds of things that were drawn out in the Chief Social Worker Isabel Trowler's review of the mother and baby unit application process. That was published in 2022, made some very strong recommendations about the need for improved understanding and confidence among social workers, and much better processes within the justice system as well for making decisions about whether women can be safely supported to have their baby with them while in custody. She also backs our viewpoint and the viewpoint of many others that ultimately the best thing is to avoid that women entering the prison system in the first place, if at all possible. There's huge issues with the distance from the home local authority for women who are in prison. As I said, I think the average is about 120 miles from home. Sometimes it can be 200 miles, particularly where you're factoring in the need to be at a prison with a mother and baby unit, because only 6 out of the 12 women's prisons have a mother and baby unit. So you might need to move even further away. And that creates huge communications challenges for involving women in these proceedings. Women in prison don't, as I'm sure you realise, have access to the internet. It's very hard. You can do emails, but they have to go through a very rigorous and a very slow process with the prison to exchange information that way. Visits can be very, very difficult to arrange. And so the chances of women being able to play a kind of really meaningful role in those proceedings are very, very limited. That also creates issues for maintaining contact with children who are already in care, for instance. And the 26-week time frame, which is challenging to meet in the community, is certainly not designed for addressing all of those difficulties that the prison system creates. Also, women's trust and engagement once they are involved in the criminal justice system. Their trust and engagement with statutory services is incredibly weak. They, as we all know, will view all statutory services as part of the same. They'll tar them all with the same brush, and it can take a huge amount of work for someone to overcome those barriers. That's quite often a service that we provide as an independent voluntary sector organisation. We find it a bit easier to build trust and engagement with women, and then we establish a sort of bridge into the statutory services that are there to support them. That's a huge minefield to navigate while in custody. And women often describe, this phrase comes up all the time, feeling that they are out of sight, out of mind once they are in the prison system for local authorities, because they're sort of, we know where they are, we know that they won't be coming out without us knowing, and so we'll kind of prioritise other things. We won't contact them in the same way that we would with someone else. And whether that's true or not, the fact that women feel like that is something to be addressed, I think. There's some amazing practice going on. Some of you might have heard about it. A charity called PACT got some funding, charitable funding, to deliver a service to embed social workers in prisons, in women's prisons. They did this in 2 prisons as a pilot. This is in direct response to a recommendation from a Conservative Lord called Lord Farmer, who did a very detailed report looking at opportunities to reduce reoffending through preserving family ties, family relationships in the men's prisons, and also then he did a separate report in women's. And his recommendation from the women's report was to have social workers embedded in every prison to act as a bridge between the women on the inside and the social work teams on the outside, to make sure that they could have contact with their children, they could be reunited with their children after release, that they could play an active role in their children's lives while they were in custody. And the government had not accepted that recommendation, so PACT went away and got some charitable funding and started doing that work. The evaluation sings its praises, and it's something that needs to be mainstreamed across the estate. Unfortunately, at the moment, the Ministry of Justice have decided to pilot a slightly different version of that service that doesn't really take on board some of the kind of critical findings of that evaluation, I would say. But I'm sort of hopeful that one day we'll get there. Just before I wrap up, I wanted to kind of bring the spotlight onto housing as one of the biggest issues. Many women lose their homes when they enter prison, and when they are then released from prison, they are homeless or in very, very insecure housing. Pregnant women, families with young children are prioritised in law for housing, as are women with criminal justice contact. The homelessness code of guidance sets this out, as I've put on the slide. But despite this, less than half of women, when they leave prison, leave to settled accommodation. It is a huge, huge issue. And in terms of being reunited with your children, or re-establishing contact with your children, or working towards reunification, it is the thing that so often gets in the way. Women being housed miles and miles away from where their children are, even though they're sort of told that they can have contact, it's unworkable, not being given any money to be able to make the journey, or part of the condition of their probation saying that they are not allowed to leave a certain area, but then social work saying, well, if you can't come to the contact centre over here, you're not going to be able to see your child, and therefore you're not going to be able to prove the attachment is still there, and will move towards adoption ultimately. this is kind of paralysing for women. It is infuriating for all involved, the professionals trying to work with them as well, and I completely understand that. In our spotlight paper, we have a piece written by a woman who just very recently went through exactly this experience, and I couldn't find a better way to phrase it, so I'm just going to read it out and let you read it as I go. She described that although I was entitled to housing as a priority, this is a woman who was in prison in a mother and baby unit with her baby. So because of her baby, she was a priority. But when it came to release, she said any address I was going to move to when I was released from prison had to be approved by probation, and that was dependent on checks and assessments done by the police and children's social care. It proved impossible for these checks to be done in time for each address that the housing department identified for me. The housing team wouldn't hold the properties for long enough so that for those checks to happen, so places just kept falling through. I think it happened about 10 times. The housing team said, here's a house. They said, okay, we'll start the checks. And then the house was gone. It meant my baby and I ended up staying in prison for much longer than we should have. It was 3 months that she stayed in custody, longer than she was eligible for release, just because they couldn't all work together to find a home for us. The same issues applied to properties offered by an HMPPS linked housing scheme. In the end, the way that she got released was her solicitor contacted us, and we said, has no one looked at Hope Street, which is a residential property run by another charity called One Small Thing, which takes mothers and babies and has probation links. And it was one phone call to Hope Street, and she was moved there within 48 hours. But if she hadn't been moved then, she was coming up to the point where her baby was going to age out of the mother and baby unit, and she would have to be separated from the baby because the baby would be over the age that unit could accommodate. So that she was absolutely terrified that after all that time, she was going to be separated from her baby. So just to wrap up, in our spotlight paper, we make a number of recommendations. I'd like to ideally make less recommendations because it looks unwieldy, but ultimately there is just too much work to be done in this space. Our key call is for the end of the imprisonment of pregnant women and mothers of children under the age of 2 in all but the most exceptional circumstances. We all recognise that in a very few number of cases, custody is unavoidable. There needs to be mandatory pre-sentence reports that detail the potential impacts of not only a custodial sentence, but also things that will have to be considered in setting a community sentence or any kind of treatment requirements or conditions linked to probation. And I would say also those pre-sentence reports need to be followed by judges and magistrates, because I was speaking to a bunch of women just the other day whose pre-sentence reports had all specified that they should not enter custody, and they all ended up in prison. And they were all on, very different charges, all of which were eligible in theory for for community-based alternatives. We need to expand the provision of independent social workers in all women's prisons. We need that joint health and social care pathway across the board to bring together care for women who have involvement from social care in the 1001 days. And that needs to work equally across health, social care, criminal justice, family justice system, housing and beyond. We need to act on Chief Social Workers' recommendations. Those are many, to make sure that the mother and baby unit process is robust and fair. We need to make sure that probation understands criminal justice. Probation understands children's social care, and children's social care understand probation in a radically different way to the way things stand at the moment, so that those teams can all work together. And I know that in some parts of the country that is working better than others, so it's not a blanket statement, but there is a lot to do. And we need really detailed housing protocols to make sure that women being released from prison are top of the list for housing that is appropriate to their childcare arrangements now, and potentially, you know, for their reunification for their children, if that might happen a little bit further down the line. We also need that to be reflected for women who don't enter prison, but might be on community sentences, or while under supervision for a suspended sentence, for instance. And those things, as I said, might increase in volume. We really ultimately, to look at the bigger picture, need to prioritise funding to prevent the criminalisation of women in the 1001 days, and to prevent the likelihood of things escalating to a point where child protection proceedings are needed in the sort of newborn and infancy stage as well. And part of doing that, I think, lies in thinking about transitions for girls and women who have been in care themselves, and adopting a life course approach to addressing women's health inequalities across all systems. And that is more than enough from me. I've put my email address up on here, and I know that it can be shared separately. So what I'll do is stop sharing and hope that we can have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. That's really, really helpful and really thorough. And it still shocks me, you know, the things, and you can see that the progression of the conversation. So, I mean, for now, one of the things that I was really keen for you to talk about was, I think it's very, part where you were saying there's a potential for being out of sight, out of mind, whether it's intentional, but it's certainly experienced. And I wondered if you might share maybe some of the case examples you've had. I mean, I know that we've spoken before, we've had other speakers from PACT come and talk about their work, and also from Children Heard and Seen. So you're not the only person that's saying and it's something that we know in social work, that between two systems is naturally a gap. But I was also quite taken aback about even just the simple things like communicating, a telephone call, which is often how we communicate, or even just not being able to visit, or the distance. I wondered, what do you think's getting in the way, and how could we maybe as a group, as an organisation, help to bridge that gap, or what do you think's needed?
Yeah, there's so many answers to that question. I think there's certainly not one single answer to that. One of the things that really strikes us is how different it will be depending on the social worker involved, even if it's from the same local authority. So it shows that while there are system issues, there are fundamental system issues that the best individual practice in the world can't overcome, and we recognise those. It is quite marked when you have a social worker get involved in a woman's case in prison, or a child's case in prison, where that social worker is confident in engaging with the justice system, as opposed to sort of feeling like this is a closed system to them and it's not something that they can engage with particularly or influence. So it's very different when a social worker says, I want to come in, I want to see this woman, I want to get an understanding of what her situation is. I've never met her before, let me come in, and or I've never been to a mother and baby unit, so yes, I want to come in and have a look around, compared to a situation where a mother and baby unit assessment is going on, and you never hear from the social worker. And then suddenly, we had this the other day, unfortunately, where a decision came back on the a paper came back from the local authority social worker saying, I don't recommend a place for this woman on the mother and baby unit because a mother and baby unit in prison is not an appropriate place for a baby to be. And clearly that's not really an objection that anyone supported around that MBU board meeting, because it's been deemed to be appropriate. You can say that the mother isn't, eligible because of concerns about the care that she can offer to her baby in that environment, but to question the environment without ever having visited is really, really challenging. And ultimately the board overturned that social worker's assessment. Very rarely do boards go against what the social worker says, but in that case they did, and approved the place anyway. So I think there's a lot about confidence and understanding of the system, and it's really, really challenging for social workers to find the chances to educate themselves about that system. I understand that. I think communication is a huge issue. We still have women that get told of plans to issue proceedings for their unborn baby, and that's communicated through a letter put under the door of their cell by a prison officer, and the woman has no support while she reads that or starts to process that. The communication is a huge issue, but there are really good opportunities opening up, and I know HMPPS are investing in more materials to help social workers understand what mother and baby units are like. So yeah, out of mind, just to kind of go back to that, I think that's a feeling that women in prison have across the board. It applies to healthcare, it applies to social care. They are sort of bottom of the pile, and they are so isolated and disempowered. So that's something that the system actively creates, and I think it takes a hell of a lot of work from a social worker to kind of overcome that and to demonstrate that they're not out of sight, out of mind, actually. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because it's certainly something that I've heard in other areas of practice around mental health. For example, when somebody goes into hospital, or brain injury, the other work that I'm involved in, where somebody's coming out of hospital, it's those gaps. And I think, in the reviews that I've done where things have gone wrong, now 10 years ago, it's still those communication gaps, but also the knowledge gaps. And you and I have spoken before about my concern that how much criminal justice is discussed in qualifying courses. And we've actually had somebody, unfortunately I can't see your name, you're coming up to me as an unknown user, that you're a social work master's student, and agree with the point that Kirsty made earlier, which is that social workers' knowledge and experiences are lacking in criminal justice services. I say this, you're Tracy, hiya Tracy. I say this as this topic has been broached once during my studies, hence me joining today and wanted to learn more. Apologies, can't turn camera on. So that's, I don't know whether you wanted to say anything about that, Tracy, with Mike, but it's set with your mic on, sorry, not with Mike, the person. So if there was, I do think one of the things that I would love to see, obviously energies suffice, is if we could have this crossover in part of the curriculum up and down the country about the crossover between maternity and paternity and prison. But for this particular instance around, the 194 a year, and that am I right in thinking that doesn't include miscarriage?
It may include some miscarriages, some pregnancies that end in miscarriage, but they don't disaggregate miscarriage, stillbirth, etc. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's why I go in and speak to Caroline's students to do exactly this. And I interestingly, as sort of part of a wider reflection on exactly this point, last week I was at an event, a probation focused event, looking at the impact of planned reforms to the criminal justice system on probation, and particularly there's proposals to end the use of short prison sentences of up to 12 months and to have everyone receiving up to 12 months prison sentences currently managed in the community, unless there are particular reasons why that's not appropriate. If that goes ahead, then you've got a lot of additional probation caseload. And what was discussed at this probation meeting at a huge amount of length was the flip side of what we're talking about today, how probation needs to become much more social work focused, to re-find its social work approach, and to be much more relationship led, to build kind of very close ties, individual ties, have smaller caseloads, you know, to really be needs led in the way that they see social work, and in the way that I suppose, you know, is closer to the Scottish system. But, you know, it's interesting that both sides are talking about the same thing. Social work saying, well, you know, we need to understand criminal justice better. Criminal justice is saying we need to take a more social work approach. It's how do we get it to meet in the middle and actually happen? I think one of the answers to that is massive investment, so that everyone has smaller caseloads and can actually work in the way that they want to work to do that. But, you know, there's an intention there, I think, to close that gap, but I haven't seen any concrete proposals that would close that gap.
I think that really, you know, cheeses me off, you know, because it was, and you know, I get cheesed off quite easily about this thing, but that was an ideological shift in night. For those who are not familiar with it, and I feel now I'm old enough to I can sort of talk about a bit of history, but we're only talking about 1996, 95, where there was an ideological shift where probation was seen as not part of social work. And so there was a change in education, and that was at the time that I was becoming a social worker. So I came back to Scotland, which wasn't a bad thing. And in Scotland, criminal justice social work has stayed a part of social work. That's not to say it's a panacea and everything's rainbows and unicorns, but what we've had down here was social work courses were unable to bid for the new probation training. So you had not only an ideological shift, but an actual commercial decision that educations needed to be absolutely split. So what I've certainly noticed, having worked in probation all my days, I think I've spent 20 odd years in probation and youth justice, was just increasingly a lack of knowledge around things that criminal justice bump into every day. Things like working with anger, working with addiction, working with all the bumps in the road that humanity, as humans, we have. But also that sense, I think somebody from PACT said that they had had a social worker say that they wondered if someone lost parental responsibility if they went into prison. So we're talking about some basic legal applications. So it's music to my ears that you're at that meeting about probation. So perhaps we can catch up with, I mean, and who was saying that? Because there's definitely a need from our end and a want from our end to be more connected. So I think we've got, so it's good to hear the conversations happening. It's just a wee bit frustrating. Not that it was perfect before, but there was that connection. And somebody, so I'll come to you, Leanne, but so somebody said, or just be really clear about our social work role and what we're there for, and also what we're not there for. You know, so it's about that connection. And also, I think, you know, the offender manager in prison, knowing what social work's there for and making those connections.
I think that's exactly what Wendy goes on to say, actually, in her second part of her point. She says, I was dealing with a family recently where the prison were very professionally anxious about, oh, here you are, Wendy. Why don't you speak to it yourself, Wendy?
Well, I mean, exactly that. And I'm really sorry, Kirsty, that I've only heard part of what you've been saying today. So apologies for that. But exactly the point that we had a prison, and I'm trying very hard not to breach confidence in saying this, but prison who were very professionally anxious about mum in relation to her offence and offending behaviour. And some of the expectation was that the social worker for her child would be addressing those issues. And it took some support for that social worker to be the type of social worker that you were describing, Kirsty, which is the one that says, I am here for this. This is my role. These are the parameters of my role. This is what I can achieve. This is what I can't achieve on my own. Now, we're taking some learning from that matter because there's some other things for us to learn there. But actually that was part of the point. The professional network that were involved in the criminal justice issues were bleeding their professional anxiety into the child welfare issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can work the other way as well.
Absolutely.
In other cases. And I think there's such a kind of there's such a gap around the care of the mother in the prison that there's very often kind of efforts to draw in more support from outside, which is kind of inappropriate. And it's the value that the PACT pilot has shown. Actually, if you've got someone embedded in the prison who can then kind of hold those boundaries and say, right, well, you know, we're here to do this, that professional's there to do that, and sort of navigate that system as a social worker, and hold everyone in their respective roles. I think that has worked incredibly well for PACT. Sorry, Leanne, we should come to you.
No, I think everything I was going to say you've kind of covered, really. And it's my background's in youth justice, and that kind of out of sight, out of mind. You see it with children going into custody as well, you know, unfortunately with social care. And I think it's just there's so much fear around the criminal justice system in social work, around not knowing how to navigate it, because, like, you know, someone had said in the comments, there is no training around that. It isn't addressed within social work education enough. And then when it comes to, I mean, we've been told at the youth offending team, you know, that our placement, a placement with us for a student wouldn't count as a statutory placement sometimes, you know, and it's just the level of assessment and the work that we do is so valuable, and it has to go all together. And also that whole family approach. The number of social workers I see who, when a father is in prison or mother and they're coming out on licence conditions and they have no idea how to understand what that is or who to speak to, you know, and it is just, I think, yeah, we kind of need to go full circle and kind of re-embrace probation within the work that we do. But yeah, I think it is a bit of a forgotten art, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Oh, we've got 2 Carolines now as well, so that's nice. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I do think it's about everyone coming together. It's not one system doing well and the other one not doing well. I think, and actually what we very often see is, I've said several times, really excellent practice, including in other systems like the housing or the sort of mental health treatment or the drug and alcohol services, like all of these things. It's what works is known and demonstrable. It's just that they can't draw it all together. And a large bit of that, part of that is money and funding to be able to have the space to work together properly. But there's a sort of lot of just mutual understanding that makes that really, really difficult as well.
But I think, can you hear me? It's fabulous. I've managed to get in. It's interesting because this is a conversation I think I've had with BASWA for so long. So thank you, Leanne, for that. That's exactly I think what's you've raised here, Kirsty, is again, you're touching on the similar vibes and the need for social workers to understand this. It's a relatively small area of practice. However, it's one of those areas of practice that it's about knowing where to go and just knowing enough to know that there's a thread to be pulling on here. And one of the things that I'm working on separately is about brain injury social work education and actually creating a toolkit. And I'm wondering how much of an appetite we have to actually gathering all the resources that we've got, so that social workers, and it will always be those social workers who are wanting to find out, but if we could actually get together and collate together a toolkit about these areas of practice from the group we've got, in a way that actually perhaps we can then push. For example, JSWEC, the Joint University Social Education Committee, has just come out with their call for abstracts for their conference in June. Could we get in there and say, like, how do we get this into, get a workshop together? How do we get this into every course?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so as well as educating social work on these issues. I think what's really important as well is that there are ways for social work to educate the justice system.
100%.
You know, there's so much, when you boil it down, there's so much that social work has to teach the justice system, particularly probation, and particularly now as that we're going to potentially have a lot more people in the community than we do currently. That it should be that social work are being listened to and allowed to kind of shape and inform that work, as well as just understanding it better themselves.
I made some queries about the PQIP course, which is the course that probation trainees go through. And a lot, again, it's a very tight curriculum. And the option is available for an input, but it would be a recorded option. So there isn't so much that opportunity to really embed. But I think it would be really interesting if, from a central perspective, perhaps we could get together as a group about how to make it. And the other thing we were saying about the brain injury social education, because it's very similar parallels, is about how to make sure it's CPD, so it's for lifelong learning.
Yeah.
And particularly given teams turnover and staffing, you're not necessarily having that. Maybe in my day there was somebody who'd been there for 20 years and knew every back road in Harlow. You're not having that team legacy knowledge in the same way. So how can we make sure that we have an accessible point of contact, or as somebody described it in our research, a Google directory for social work that people knew, they just found you easily.
Yeah. And I think revisiting training is across your career is really important with the justice system as well, because despite the fact that ultimately very little changes in the justice system at a kind of macro level, it's the system that gets tinkered with by government, among the most often, alongside health, I would probably say. But there is always reform to the criminal justice system going on, and it's really hard to stay up to date with sentencing practice, probation models, rehabilitation approaches. It's relentless. So yeah, and I'm really conscious as well that there's a huge injection of money going into training a vast number of probation officers at the moment, all these young new probation officers, which is amazing and encouraging, but not if it's all rushed and they can't. It just sort of makes these existing kind of gaps and challenges even worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd be really keen to have that conversation as well, if there's stuff that we can feed into that approach.
I think there's an appetite. It's about the how, isn't it? So, and I think I'm not suggesting, like you say, I think there's things that social work can learn, but there's also things social work can teach. Yeah. But it's that, I think, the ethical grounding, and certainly when I've spoken to newly qualified probation officers, they feel it's quite challenging as a course, which is the same for social work. But they do come away with the want to be more ethically minded, but the processes become more the focus, which again is very social work and police and nurse and so there's an opportunity here to develop the conversation. So I mean, I really appreciate what you're sharing, and hopefully, you can see that this is a conversation you're not alone in, and that women deserve better. And so I really appreciate you saying this.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think the discussion, as always with these things, has just been so interesting, and yeah, I mean, it's confirmed some things in my mind about the need to focus on building education and awareness, but also, I really want to kind of think about opportunities for each side to educate each other a little bit and support the kind of common direction of travel, really, between probation particularly and social work. So I'm sure we'll follow that up, between us, but I'll be definitely mulling that over for a bit. So thank you. Yeah, just really glad to come along and share it with you. And if you want, if anyone wants anything, sort of in a different format or just let me know and I can share things as and when.
and everyone has access to the web pages, and they can, through that, they can contact you if there's anybody here that would like a bespoke piece of work. But I would certainly read the whole cause in terms of where you're going and what you're calling for. But it's as you say, it's a fast-moving pace. And with that human experience, it's also seeing what Charlie Taylor came out with yesterday with the mental health. You do wonder to what extent in Eastwood Park, for example, just what's pregnant women are experiencing. You know, yeah. When I think he was describing it in Channel 4 last night, that he was walking through cells that seemed almost like bedlam.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, it's absolutely crumbling. So on that cheery note, I think we've got a plan, and we've got aims. So 100% thank you so much, Kirsty, for joining us.